Well, it's nice to see everyone this morning. Is the audio okay? Everyone can hear me in the back of the room? Thumbs up from the corners? We're good audio-wise? Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm Jonathan Davis. I'm from Georgetown University and MedStar Health in Washington, D.C. And it's a pleasure to talk to you this morning about leadership pearls and pitfalls. And by show of hands, because I think this question was asked earlier, is there anyone in the room who is not a rising chief resident? So the vast majority here are rising chief residents, which is exceptional. And that's what we're here to talk about, some of the challenges and some of the things that will help in the year ahead, and also, very importantly, how to avert some of the major pitfalls, because there's a lot of landmines in the process. So if our slide advancer is working, if not, I will stand up here. So we have a little activity for you once we get through the front matter. So our goal for today is very simple. It is to be the boss that you would want to have. And we can all certainly remember times in our lives where we've dealt with people that haven't necessarily upheld these principles. So our objective specifically, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about emotional intelligence, something called EI and also referred to as EQ. Very, very important component of leadership success. We're going to identify strategies to refine your leadership repertoire, specifically when we're talking about emotional intelligence. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, we're going to go through a list of leadership pitfalls. So here's our roadmap for meeting our goals and objectives. First and foremost, we're going to talk about why this topic even matters. Then we're going to talk about EQ for the EP in the ED. So emotional intelligence, and then we're going to launch into ED leadership, pearls and pitfalls, and hopefully round it out with some conclusions that are tangible things that you can bring home back to your programs the very next day. So starting next week as you're struggling with July schedules or August schedules, whatever the next set of challenges for you in the road ahead, giving you tangible things to help. So there is a lot of further reading, and again, I have zero financial disclosures at all. The only thing I will say is that I'm a ravenous consumer of a lot of literature that's outside of the realm of emergency medicine. And one thing that I found very helpful is a lot of stuff in the business and management realm where they talk about these leadership principles on a regular basis. And certainly something that we don't often see in academic emergency medicine, annals of emergency medicine, etc. So yeah, I know. Like, why is this topic so important? So why are we all here? We have been exposed to leaders in some capacity our entire lives. It goes before medical school, before we were undergrads. It started with coaches, it started with teachers. You know, every single thing that we've done in our lives, we've been exposed to leaders. And specifically, everyone sitting in this room, you're taking on a major step in leadership by assuming the position of chief resident for your program. So, non-scientific poll. And I can tell you that studies have shown us that 85% of statistics are made up on the spot. So we'll see if we can make a statistic here. So by simple show of hands, who here has ever worked with a leader or a boss who just doesn't seem to get it? Show of hands. Be honest here. Now, what's always most disconcerting whenever I ask this question is all the folks from my team just raise their hand right away. So it's an important point. And this brings us into our brief leadership exercise. And you'll see something hopefully on your tables. If not there yet, they will be there momentarily. We're going to take an opportunity to talk to one another at tables. And we're going to do report out. So I'm going to pick random tables here for report out. So I want everyone to be prepared for a report out. One or two key characteristics of those bosses that just don't seem to get it. We're also going to ask a similar question. What are the one or two key characteristics of bosses that you've had, that you've been exposed to in some capacity, who just seem to get it? They inspire the team. They make you feel good about the work that you're doing, because that's ultimately what we're looking for. So, handouts on tables? Excellent. So if you can just take a few minutes, and we'll give about 3 or 4 minutes breakout, talk amongst yourselves into two asks. One or two key characteristics of bosses that don't get it, and contrast it with a few characteristics for bosses that do. Excellent. Perfect. Thank you. Oh, excellent. Thanks. All right. Had an opportunity to jot down some traits. Bosses who seem to get it. Contrasting it with bosses who just don't seem to get it. So we're going to give it about another 30 seconds, and we're going to ask for some report outs for your thoughts on this. I grabbed the... Excellent. Hand it around. Thanks. It's okay. Thank you.
If you guys need pens, we have some pens, so just raise your hand and I'll send Patrick around with some pens. Thank you.
Guys come up with some good ones. Yeah, all right, excellent, excellent. That's the purpose of this too, so that's great. All right, why don't we go ahead and wrap up. We're going to ask for a couple of tables to report out. What we're looking for, first and foremost, one or two key characteristics of bosses that just don't seem to get it, and or characteristics of bosses that are very, very successful. Does anyone want to volunteer? Any tables want to volunteer? I see some volunteers right over here. Excellent, excellent. This should be on for you.
Can we do the positives? Or...
Whichever one you'd like. Go for it.
We'll do a couple positives. So we said someone who's a good communicator, frequent communication with the whole team and the department. Someone who's empathetic, action-oriented, as well as engaging for positive qualities.
Excellent, excellent. And we're going to talk about all those things. Very, very good points. What about the negative side? Bosses that you've worked with who just don't seem to get it. Anyone want to share any? I have many examples during this talk, I can tell you. But is anyone willing to share? Excellent.
So we've got a couple down for the negatives. We feel like maybe someone who's in this because of power and they're power hungry would be more of a negative characteristic. And then someone who's unaware of how maybe the decisions are affecting other individuals in different positions.
Excellent. So all excellent points, and that is a perfect segue into emotional intelligence. Because what The two groups that reported out, and thank you for doing that, they talked about key foundational emotional intelligence skills. So what is EQ? Marginal factor that can have a tremendous impact. And you look at CEOs from successful companies, they are often not the straight A students. They often are not the most technically proficient in whatever their discipline is. Where they excel for successful companies is that they know how to deal with people. And that's where the whole concept of emotional intelligence comes into play. So the real question for us as emergency medicine leaders is how can we adapt and apply what is very well known in the CEO and business realm to our daily mill, so to what we're doing on a regular basis. And let's do a quick contrast here, because the first question that often arises is, what is EQ and how does it relate to IQ? Big difference. IQ, innate set point, can be maximized but not as readily extended. And I can tell you that I will never be as smart nor as creative as any of those people that you see listed there. Never will have the creativity of Steve Jobs. Never will have the smarts of Albert Einstein. But fortunately, it doesn't matter to be a great leader. What's more important is emotional intelligence. And there is an innate baseline, but unlike IQ, EQ can be readily shaped, refined, groomed, adapted, and molded over time. And the way that it can be adapted is through insight and feedback, and actually digesting the feedback that's given to you. And sometimes feedback can be very, very difficult to digest. So here are the core elements of emotional intelligence. We're not going to spend too much time on this slide, but it's good just to have that 3,000-foot view of the landscape. Self-awareness, self-management. What does it mean when you're a leader, and I'm sure every single person has seen this, and you walk onto a shift, it's 3 p.m., you slam down the first 7 charts, and you say, ugh, another day. Whenever I come into the emergency department, it's always like this. What type of impacts does it have on the rest of the team? Is that an inspiring stance that's going to help inspire the team that you're working with that day? Social awareness, empathy, something that was already mentioned. An organizational awareness. What are the goals of the organization? And how are the things that we're doing day in and day out, managing and leading the residency program, taking care of patients, ultimately tying into the broader vision of the organization? And finally, perhaps most importantly, it's all of this relationship management. And this is a key point of being a chief resident. You will have a major role in all of these competencies that you see listed in blue. Influence, being a coach and mentor, not only to more junior colleagues, but one of the greatest challenges of the chief year is also taking this role with colleagues that are at the same level as you. Folks that you started internship with 3 or 4 years prior. Conflict management, huge part of the job, and we're going to talk about some strategies for that. Teamwork, and then finally, inspirational leadership. Your goal at the end of the chief year should be to leave the program in a better place than when you started. And that doesn't mean that the folks behind you that you're following have done a bad job at all, but every team should leave their mark and move the meter in a positive direction. So that brings us into our pearls and pitfalls. How can we operationalize this? Where does the rubber meet the road? So here are our top 10 ED leadership lessons. Now, I'll put the important disclaimer here that I am certainly not an expert in any of these. And in fact, the 10 points I'm going to give you are all predicated on mistakes that I personally have made. So I'm a student, I'm not an expert, and I continue to make many mistakes on a regular basis. But most important is being receptive to that feedback. And feedback can be hard at times, but that feedback is the only way that all of us are going to get better at what we're doing. So point number 1, supporting those whom you empower. I'll give you a perfect example of this. You're a chief resident. You create a schedule. Schedules, I don't know if anyone's told you yet, can create conflicts at times. So you do a great job and craft the best schedule, but undoubtedly there's someone that's not happy with their schedule. So they come to you, and you look at it, and you say, you know, I used fair, sound principles in creating this schedule. I can't make a change. Disgruntled resident says, you know, I'm not happy with this. I'm going to approach senior leadership of the program. I'm going to go to one of the trusted APDs. I'm going to go directly to the program director. I might even go right to the chair, because this is very upsetting to me. So the chair, or the PD, or the APD, overturns the decision that you made earlier as chief and says, I gotcha, we'll hook you up this time, don't worry, I'll talk to the chiefs and I'll kind of smooth things over. How would that make you feel in your role as a person who has to subsequently craft schedules for the next 11 months? Completely undermined. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. There are issues of law and then there's issues of fact. So let's say a resident came to you and they said, you know something, we're not following program and policies and procedures here. The schedule that you gave me breaks duty hour regulations or our own internal policies. Whole different issue. That's an issue of law. Policies and procedures, and you say, nope, I don't see it, I can't overturn it. They go to the program leadership, and the program leadership looks at it and says, my goodness, this is like completely discordant with everything that we have in our policy manual. That's something that needs to be overturned. But when it's overturned, it comes with a conversation. Back to the chiefs first, and then ultimately from the chiefs to the individual who complained about the schedule. Very different than these issues of fact. And I can tell you, the metric I gave you before, 85% of all statistics are made up on the spot. Around 95% of all scheduling issues are really issues of fact. It's a gray zone. You know, I'm scheduled for more weekends than anyone else in the program. Why am I working more Thursday nights than anyone else? These are the gray zone issues that kind of go with the ebb and flow of scheduling. Why is this important? Think about how you would feel in this position. And in your role as chief, you are going to be relying on your team and empowering them to do things. Whether it's to be the coordinator for the interview day dinners that occur the night before the interview days. Whatever it is that you are empowering your teammates to do, make sure that you are similarly standing behind their decisions. Because it's very, very difficult to be in the leadership role and tasked with things when you're being undermined. So that's point number one. Point number two, I can tell you this was a real challenge for me personally. You know, I thought everything was great. I was starting out and doing some academic work, and I became an associate program director, and then bam, became a program director and had to start having really difficult conversations. This is not why I went to medical school. I went to medical school to help people, and of course there's always difficult conversations during the course of our clinical work, but very different than having a difficult conversation with someone that you work with, someone that's a member of your team. These conversations are critically important though, and I'll tell you that one of the keys to leadership success is actually embracing these difficult conversations. Because the worst conversation of all is the one that you never have. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. And it gets into this whole concept of goodwill and bad faith. Friend of mine, pediatrician, somewhere in the Midwest here. Friend from medical school. She always kind of liked the EM approach, never did a PEM fellowship, worked in a pediatric clinic, but really liked the urgent care cases that came into that clinic. She noticed a specific pain point for her colleagues in the pediatric clinic. They had a very busy day, scheduled patients, and when unscheduled patients would come in that weren't quite sick enough for the ER, but needed to be taken care of in the clinic, it would disrupt the schedule, and her colleagues would just be like, I'm already scheduled for 50 patients today, and I can't crowbar these additional patients who are unscheduled into my slate. So she went to her chair and said, I got a great idea. I've always kind of liked the EM approach, and obviously I can't work in the emergency department, but how about I create an urgent care clinic for unscheduled care every morning? It's what I like doing. It's a pain point for our colleagues, and I think it would be a win-win. Went to her chair, had that conversation. Her chair said, great idea. True story. 3 weeks later, she gets an email. Announcement. The department is starting a new urgent care clinic as a component of the pediatric service line. And the new director is so-and-so. wasn't her. What did she do? Left the organization. And in speaking with her, I'm like, how could this have played out differently? Because I looked at this as like a great, consolation, let's talk about this. What are your next steps? But also, what could have been done to yield a better outcome? And she said, you know something? If my chair would have come to me and just had a very open, face-to-face, eye-to-eye conversation and said to me, great idea, we're going to move forward, but you're not the right person for this role for these reasons. Organizational skills, etc. It's whatever those reasons were. If someone would have had a face-to-face conversation with me, I would have been angry, but I wouldn't have left. But the fact that no one had the decency to have a conversation with me about this, I'm leaving the organization altogether. And it gets into this distinction of goodwill versus bad faith. Goodwill, even if a decision is not in one's favor, most will appreciate and respect the conversation. But lack of a conversation leads to really deep wounds. Think about this every day as a chief. A lot of us in medicine, I can tell you, can speak for myself, is to avoid conflict, avoid difficult conversations. But try to change your posture to march into those conversations. Not arm for bear, but to respect the other person's viewpoint, to listen, to hear, and to talk to people openly and honestly. And this brings us to our third point, placing yourself in others' shoes often. How would I react if someone sent this email correspondence to me? How would I react if someone came up to me with this feedback? So think about framing things in a way that would be very positive and proactive and productive in your world. What sort of communication would elicit an entirely different response in me? When you're crafting any email, we're going to get to point number 4. We actually have a couple of slides on e-communications. But think about it. Whenever you're crafting those long emails, think about what type of reaction this would elicit in another, and actually send it to other people to do a little pre-vetting. Say, hey, I'm thinking about sending this out to the team. I'm thinking about sending this out to the new interns. Send it to your co-chiefs. Send it to some of the second years who are trusted, who are just interns themselves, and say, hey, just want to get your confidential, off-the-record opinion on this to see how this will be potentially digested and what some of the issues that could arise from this correspondence before hitting the send button. And that brings us to the treachery of e-communications. God, I love this topic. E-communications, the e-world that we live in. Intent does not equal interpretation. This goes with emails, text messages, tweets. My new favorite, voice to text. Who here uses voice to text on their iPhone or whatever your smartphone is? I use this all the time. And I can tell you, sometimes I hit the send button, I look afterwards, and I'm like, ooh, didn't intend to say that at all. And I will also tell you that I actually, true story, lost a ski glove on a ski lift in western Pennsylvania. Why? Because I felt the buzz in my pocket, was on vacation, opened up the mobile phone and saw a message on there. I'm like, what? They can't possibly be thinking about doing that. Ripped off the glove, shoo, fell right down, got my frozen finger out there. I'm trying to reply. What's the lesson? The lesson is that there are zero emails that require an immediate reply. Zero emails that require an immediate reply. The reason I say that is that there are a few emails that require an immediate response. But if it's ever that urgent, pick up the phone and call somebody. If it's something that gets your blood boiling and it's that much urgency, we also have phone capabilities in our iPhones and other devices as well. Those are long forgotten. We rely on the e-communications. So self-embargo before you hit the reply. And the power of in-person chats or even an old school phone call seems to be lost these days. Very, very powerful. Beware the CC button. You really want to piss somebody off? Send them an email and CC their boss. That's always a way to start a good conversation. Really just pisses people off. Now, does it accomplish anything? Sometimes. But I think a much more transparent way of doing it is to email the person, CC the boss if necessary, and then include in the body of your email, I am including so-and-so because of X. I want them to be aware so we can all have a conversation together. Whatever the point is, just make it very overt, very transparent, and very much part of the conversation, not a passive-aggressive, I'm just going to throw in your boss, the VPMA, and the CMO of the hospital as well. The BCC button. Gotta love the BCC. I'm still trying to figure out how BCC works. I include it, and then someone replies all. Is everyone included, or just the BCC person? I have seen so many problems arise from people being blind CC'd. I think a much better approach, and certainly something that I have adopted as a non-tech person, is if there's someone I want to BCC, I embargo, I don't BCC them, I send the email, and then I forward it to them as a separate chain. Because I've seen so many mismatched, unintended communications from the BCC, I can tell you story after story. Autocorrect and abbreviations. Now, I'm going to show you an actual screenshot. This is a true screenshot from my wife's cell phone. Now, it was sent to me by my 12-year-old daughter. So my wife sent an email to her boss. She asked, are you available to meet? She didn't hear back from her boss for a couple of minutes, so she offered up some date suggestions, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. The boss texted back, WTF, what? And my wife said, what? Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday? Then my daughter saw my wife texting and said, Mommy. And my wife's like, oh my goodness. The point is that abbreviations can get you into trouble. Be very, very cautious when texting or emailing with abbreviations. Now, point number 5, change. I used to think that change management meant sending an email or announcing something at a meeting or conference. Change is a process. If you're going to remember one thing from this point, change is a process. Humans do not like change. Doctors do not like change. Look at the institution of EHRs across all of our hospitals and all of healthcare. Remember that you have to actively manage the process. There's pre-vetting that needs to occur. There is the actual note, the message that goes out announcing whatever that change is, and then there's monitoring for the unintended and sometimes intended consequences of a given change. Important. Anytime you're making a change in your program, whether it's with scheduling, whether it's with policies, procedures, pre-vet these issues. Have conversations, talk to stakeholders, get their input, make them part of the solution, as opposed to 3 chiefs or 4 chiefs getting together and deciding what is going to be dispelled across the program. Never leads to good outcomes. And this is very, very well studied in the business literature. Organizational psychologist John Cotter, he comes up with the 7 steps of change. And the actual sending of the email or announcing something at a meeting or event is one tiny fraction of this entire timeline of enacting change. Utilizing the heads-up method. Always better to talk about something beforehand, transparently, eye to eye, talk about things before just sending that email. Point number 6. We only have 10 points to go here. Point number 6. This is a tough one for emergency docs. All of us, or I shouldn't speak for everyone, many of us have that ADHD type of thing going. You've seen me pacing around the room here. It is tough for me to listen at times. And this is something that I had to learn. Why? I was trained as an emergency physician. You know, I learned in medical school to ask broad, open-ended questions and listen for a long period of time. And then I got into EM residency, where that didn't work. And all of a sudden, we were seeing upwards of 20 or more patients in a single 8 or 9 hour period. Man, if I ask an open-ended question on every turn, I'm going to be here for hours. You don't. You ask closed-ended questions, and you're used to dispositioning patients. That's your mindset. That's what you've been trained to do. But being a chief resident, being a leader, is not a series of quick dispos. Listen, gather intel, reflect, and ultimately decide. Resist the urge to hyper-reply. Talked about it before. If there's ever an email that you feel compelled to reply immediately, embargo, think, can this wait to the next day? And 95% of them can. But the 5% that can't, pick up the phone, make the call. The other point is, and you'll see this a lot as a chief resident, avoid getting cornered into snap decisions. I had this happen the other day. I was at a meeting at our health system, and someone asked me a question about, you need to tell me who the people were that da-da-da-da. And I said, let's talk about this offline. My bottled response. Because I didn't want to just talk openly in the meeting about some very, very personal issues that were happening at a service line in our hospital. It just wasn't the appropriate forum for it. But all of a sudden, when a boss, a leader, comes to you and says, we need an answer right now. The code red, it was the code red. That's our automatic response. Have bottled responses. And the one important bottled response, I'll get back to you shortly. It's a variant of let's take this offline and we'll talk about it later. I'll give you a perfect example of this. Several years ago in our program, I was a new program director. There was an issue regarding the venue for graduation. Now, if you talk about seismic issues, venue for graduation is definitely one of them. This was a big issue, but knowing the emotions of the group, I could see that this was a very pertinent, important issue. I show up at conference, hanging out in the back, grabbing some coffee, grab a pastry. All of a sudden, I see a swarm of folks kind of looking at me and looking away. As a chief, that's never, ever a good sign. As a program director, never, ever a good sign. So I'm like, no big deal. Next break, I see them swarming a little bit closer, looking and looking away real quick. And sure enough, right at the end of conference, I have about 8 people on me. And they said, we have an issue with X, Y, or Z. We need a decision right now. It's April. Graduation's coming up in June. My goodness, backed into a corner, bottled response, a namaste moment. Let me listen. What are the important points here? What's concerning you? And what can we do to help? Listen to all the information. Let me think about it over the weekend, and I promise I'll get back to you by Monday. Gives you time to reflect, decide, digest, talk to other program leaders, talk to the budget office and the CFO to see if it's feasible. It's a great way to diffuse a situation, so avoid getting cornered into those snap decisions. Point number 7, and you will definitely see this during your chief year. Beware the holidays. The first bit of advice I got from my chair at the time when I took over as program director several years ago was beware the holiday period. Be very cautious with schedules and making changes during the holidays. I'm like, why? You know, like what type of advice is that? I thought you were going to give me real advice that I need to get started here. And he's like, trust me, tough time in the academic calendar. Days are short. Weather, at least in my neck of the woods, not great. The luster of July has faded, and the joy of completing the next academic step is in the distant. It's June. It's a really tough time of the year. So what does that mean to you? Scheduling, especially holiday scheduling, extra sensitivity. Be as transparent as you can in the process. Make sure you line up all the information. Let everyone know what the process is and how you're trying to uphold principles. Everyone needs to work, but here's how we're going to equally as we can, equitably, distribute the labor. And be particularly mindful of enacting change. The midpoint of the academic year, January 1st. What a great time to enact change. Just so happens to be the roughest time of the academic year for many. And you see this time and time again. Step number 8, stepping away from those emotional triggers. Gets to the point with email that we talked about before. If there is anything that gives you a visceral response, take a step back. Everyone has these triggers. I see the chief officer, medical officers, and the hospital presidents in our health system. What are their actual emotional triggers? When they hear about physician compensation, doctors complaining about how much they get paid. It's a trigger. You see their body language changes, they contort their face. It's a very uncomfortable thing, clearly a trigger. What are those triggers for us? You have a group of interns, group of second years. We'd like to talk about our clinical hours. Or we'd like to talk about our schedule as a group. We're very upset about our scheduling. Those can be emotional triggers for you as the person that's crafting the schedule. So what is the lesson? Namaste moment. Don't just react. Take a step back, reflect, analyze, sound rationale. Again, conversation is better than no conversation at all. Most people will digest reasonable information if it's laid out there in a transparent fashion. Might not be the answer that they wanted, but it's giving an answer in a transparent and equitable fashion. And that brings us to point number 9. Be reasonable, transparent, and consistent. Consistency is perhaps the most important of all. Always remember, and I think this is a good one under consistency, do only as you would be able to do for X. And X equals the number of other residents in your program. It's a very, very powerful statement. I would love to give you all of the holidays off, but I can't do that because if I did that for you, in fairness, I would have to offer a similar opportunity for all of our other 29 residents. And then if we do it for all of us, the whole house of cards falls down because we're not upholding our end of the bargain by being team players, and our important component of the workforce is absent during the holidays when the housekeeping team is here, the nursing team is here, the administrative team is here. Very important principle. So be reasonable. Communicate your rationale, transparent, sound policies and procedures. And if you're finding that you're needing to change or give one-offs or variances to policies or procedures a lot, it means you need to change the policy. Should be exceedingly rare that you actually have to give a variance to a given policy. Now, I can tell you when I started in leadership and residency administration and ultimately departmental administration, I had a full head of dark hair, but after several years, this is what leadership can do. So what does it mean? Point number 10, fostering resiliency. It's important to keep yourself healthy in the process. Well-being is such a huge component of our lives as physicians. We have stressful jobs. So continue to do the things that you enjoy doing that make you better at work. For some, it might be exercising regularly. For others, it might be enjoying a good novel. Make sure that you're giving yourself time to enjoy the journey. Because being a chief, being an administrator, very, very tough job at times. You have to give yourself a break and continue to do those things that you enjoy. So the healthier the leader, the sturdier the oars. The sturdier the oars, the stronger the ship. And the healthy leader actually practices what they preach. And remember, be the boss that you would want to have. So what is the well-balanced leader? You all have accomplished so much to get to where you are here. You're intelligent, you have the technical skill, you've done incredibly well in residency to be sitting in this room. EQ is something that can be sharpened, groomed, and refined over time. And don't forget about the VQ. That is the ventilation perfusion mismatch. And don't have a mismatch, because whether it's exercise or some other thing, do things to keep yourself healthy. And this is what I like to refer to as the leadership triad. And you notice at no point here does it involve vanity, GQ, or Vogue. So none of that. So back to our top 10, and we're going to round it out. Point number 1, support those whom you empower. Remember how it would feel if residency leadership undermined what you were trying to accomplish as chief. Make sure that you uphold those same principles when you're empowering the rest of the team to do important things to the mission of the residency program. Embrace that difficult conversation. Not a natural set point for many of us. Place yourself in others' shoes often. Pre-vet emails. I do this all the time. I send emails to a trusted few before I send them out broadly. Once you hit the send button, it's kind of like Jerry Maguire. It's gone. It's out there. Make sure that you pre-vet these contentious issues. Treachery of e-communications, man, be really, really cautious. There are 0 emails that require an immediate email reply. If it's that important, which is very rare, pick up the phone and call. Actively managed change. Change is much more than an email, text message, or a message at conference in person. It's an actual process. Get people together, talk about it, and after you enact the change, make sure you're doing that post-vetting. Learn to listen can be difficult for us emergency physicians. Beware the holidays. Be very, very sensitive about holiday scheduling. Step back from those emotional triggers. If you feel the blood boiling up, as I did on that ski lift, and I'm ripping off a glove, shoo, think twice. It's an emotional trigger. Step back. Doesn't require an immediate reply. Be reasonable, transparent, and most importantly, consistent in your approach. Make sure you're treating one as you would treat 29 or 49 or 69 others in your program. And finally, make it a real focus and priority to keep yourself healthy as well. So we're back to our original goal of being the boss that you would want to have. Hopefully we've hit our objectives. I had someone mention last night, is this a prayer? No, this is a namaste moment. Remember your IQ, your VQ, and your EQ. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.